Well, to assess Margaret Thatcher's legacy to Scotland, we're now joined by Colin MacKay, a former political editor of STV, Lord Michael Forsyth, a minister in the Thatcher government who later became Scottish Secretary, and Jim Sillars, a former deputy leader of the SNP. Jim, I know this first question's very, very broad brush, but what do you think her main Scottish legacy was?
The present Conservative Party, which has almost been destroyed. It's a very strange thing. In the Scottish Parliament, the Conservative group, in terms of opposition, is probably the best there is. They brought a lot of young talent, fresh talent, and yet it's making no impact whatsoever on the Scottish electorate. And that's the legacy, the political legacy for the Conservative Party for Margaret Thatcher.
Michael, I dare say that you'll take a rather more rounded view of her legacy than that.
Well, Jim's certainly right. I mean, the Conservatives certainly took a lot of political damage for what we did, but I think the legacy is that we have a prosperous Scotland today, which has got a future because its main sources of employment are in the industries of the future and not the past. And what Margaret did was force people to face up to the realities that you couldn't actually earn a living unless you were able to sell goods and services at a price that people could pay. And we also, of course, have many people who never had a chance to have capital in their lives having capital and owning their own homes. When she started, there were more people with their own homes in the communist countries of Eastern Europe than there were in Scotland.
Colin, you observed Prime Ministers at close quarters, the wily Harold Wilson, the wooden Ted Heath, the avuncular James Callaghan. What was she like?
Well, she was very different from them because she was a woman. That was the key thing, and it was very difficult for political journalists to deal with. Here was someone who was, first of all, leading one of the oldest parties in the world, and then becoming the Prime Minister of that country. And she was very different. I mean, she was someone who used her femininity during interviews. Much as the Queen Mother had a sort of almost sexual allure, Lady Thatcher had she was a fine-looking woman. She had a fine figure. People may have hated her, but she was quite bonny to look at. And she had this impact on people. She used her femininity. If she thought, for example, that you were getting at the edge on her, she would say something like, "Just let me finish," she would say. And you look behind you to find out who she was talking about, and it was you.
Of course, after '79, the Home Rule question went off the boil, but we saw a clip there from an interview in 1976 where I thought you were looking very young, Mr. MacKay.
Yes, indeed.
What was her line at that time?
Well, on that, when I asked her, do you repledge Mr. Heath's desire for a Scottish Assembly with a budget that would be the block grant and you can spend it as you like, and she said, yep, that's fine. I mean, she was quite happy with that. She was more interested in the block grant. She seemed almost to take the Assembly at that point as a given, but not in later interviews. And
of course in '79, Jim, the SNP went down from 11 to 2 seats. They disappeared off the political map for some time, arguably to your own by-election victory. Was the personality and politics of Margaret Thatcher central to pushing the SNP forward?
Yes, we went through about 10 years of getting the blame for bringing down the Labour government. Actually, it was a chap from Ulster who brought them down because he abstained, to everybody's surprise. But we got the blame, and it took about 10 years until that bitterness against the SNP finally went down. We were given the opportunity by Michael and Margaret Thatcher when they produced the poll tax, and that allowed us to gather ourselves together and reconnect with most of the people in Scotland. Because Thatcher, if you go back to what she said at Downing Street in 1979, that where there is discord, let there be harmony, and where there is despair, let there be hope, she was a divider in Scottish society, and she produced a lot of despair instead of hope in Scottish society. And one of the legacies we've got from the Thatcher era now is that we've got a huge underclass in Scotland. There's about a third. Oh yes, we have. Oh yes, we have. And that was one of the consequences of what your government did when you were in power. And you gave us the clear impression that the market was everything, and if the market didn't solve it, nothing would solve it. And we've been left with an underclass in Scotland, which is the legacy of Thatcherism.
Michael, there's a lot to answer there, so I'm going to give you a good run to respond to that.
Well, the first thing is the Labour government had left the economy in a complete shambles. Our country was a basket case. And Jim's right, there is an underclass, but a lot of the people who were trapped in council housing that was of poor quality and which was poorly maintained, without jobs, they found themselves in that position because industries, whole industries, Bathgate, Linwood, Corpark, were forced by government to go to places where they were uneconomic, and they closed, leaving people trapped in soulless council estates. It was the Tories who gave people the chance to buy their council houses and who created the opportunities for small businesses and new enterprises to rise. I mean, I honestly think that, Jim, you're being a bit unfair in blaming Margaret Thatcher for all the problems of the underclass, when the underclass is much bigger after more than 10 years of a Labour government.
We'll come back to this in a minute. I wanted to ask Colin a point again about style, because Malcolm Rifkind has said that one of the problems that the Conservatives had in this period in terms of trying to sell Mrs Thatcher was that she was a woman, she was an English woman, and she was a bossy English woman. Anything in that?
Well, she speaks very highly of him as well in her memoirs. But I mean, the point is that, yes, she was a woman. Well, that's incontestable. She was seen by many as a sort of suburban home counties woman. And bossy, well, of course, she was a person of very strong conviction. So I'm not so sure. I think that was one of the problems, that there was a misogynism almost, which said that, you know, there was the Ditch the Bitch campaign, which started not long after she'd got to power. She'd gone through all the democratic processes. Then to say ditch the bitch, which was enormously offensive to many people, didn't seem right. So she was never going to win certain constituencies with that. She was going to have a big problem with being a woman, but then being a woman also drove her on in the publicity picture when she was standing for, she'd beaten Heath by this time, she was up against Whitelaw, and she got photographed washing the dishes. And if you remember, Willie Whitelaw's publicist decided it would be a good idea to show Willie Whitelaw, former Guards Armoured Division, Major, decorated MC, fighting Rommel, but he couldn't wash dishes. So he was shown with, you know, a squeegee in one hand and a scraper in the other, saying, what do I do with this?
Jim, getting it back to sort of more weighty matters of state, if I can put it like that. I mean, in your last answer, you were articulating what you thought one of the legacies was. Now, there was no question that in terms of traditional industries, the view was that if they are loss-making, the state should not artificially prop them up. But in other sectors, for example, did she really tackle the size of the public sector in Scotland? Didn't she, in a sense, almost create welfare dependency through the very high levels of unemployment that we saw at that point?
Well, once unemployment reached a certain level, and we got into the position where you got generations of people who hadn't worked, then you had the start of the underclass. And Michael's quite right when he says that not the whole of the underclass is responsible to Margaret Thatcher, but she established the underclass as a factor, a dependency factor in the life of our society. And Brown and company, and you saw Brown telling us that, you know, she was a great conviction politician. His policies have actually extended the number of the underclass in our society. And there's a big difference between the underclass and what was the Scottish working class. The Scottish working class was aspirational. The great tragedy of the underclass is it is not aspirational, and it's extremely difficult to get people from that position into a work mentality.
Michael?
I think Jim's forgotten what happened. I mean, I remember there was a new deep water terminal at Hunterston, and for 5 months it wasn't allowed to operate. The oil carriers had to come into Scotland, and they were turned back into Europe. The cargo was unloaded, put into small boats, which then had to come back to Glasgow and then on to Ravenscraig, because there was a row between two unions. Inflation was running at 25%. Interest rates were at 17%. Everybody had written Britain off. It wasn't Margaret Thatcher that caused that. It was trade union militancy. And she reformed the trade unions. She gave them back to their members. The trade union bosses could take away a man's job by taking away his trade union membership. She completely transformed the country and created new prosperity, which you can see all around you, even in the midst of this present Labour recession.
Colin, let's move on to the sort of electoral impact of Mrs Thatcher, because some commentators say, well, she was the catalyst for decline. But of course, in the 87 election, as was pointed out in the package, the Conservatives fell to 11. What they would give to have 11 MPs in Scotland now. So was the vote, in a sense, in 87 and the votes during the Thatcher years, not just an anti-Conservative vote rather than an anti-Thatcher vote?
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting question, that, because there's a lot in that as a proposition. The other thing, though, is that Mrs Thatcher's impact was so great that even once she'd left in 1990, there was still a feeling of the Conservative Party was identified with Mrs Thatcher. And right through until Mr Cameron felt that there were certain things he had to disengage from. He was talking about a woman who left office almost 20 years ago. That is the power of Mrs Thatcher. Michael sees it for good and Jim for otherwise, but the fact is that she was so powerful that it was very difficult to tease out apart the point at which she retired and the point at which she ceased to have impact on the party or the voter.
Michael?
Well, the thing that Mrs. Thatcher did, that the left could never forgive, is she created New Labour. She destroyed old Labour and she destroyed socialism as an ideal. I mean, we now have a Labour government which believes in enterprise, or says it, or up till now has said it did. And the basic tenets of the free market economy have been accepted. We even have the SNP arguing for lower corporation tax and things of that kind. She won the intellectual argument when she defeated socialism.
I want to come on to that point, but why was it constituencies in '87, which had been hitherto very safe Conservative constituencies like Edinburgh South and Strathkelvin-Bearsden, were lost? Now, you may well say a lot of people were public sector workers, a big public sector in Scotland, but did she really shake up the public sector in Scotland?
She did a lot of things which were very difficult and very unpopular. If you have a very unfair system of funding local government, which, by the way, we've still got today in the council tax, and if you try to change it so that people who are able to pay contribute towards it, who've never had to pay before, that is unpopular. She was someone who didn't care about popularity. She cared about doing what was right for the country. And by the way, she didn't care much about what people said about her, but she did care about what people said about her country. She was a conviction politician who was determined to transform Britain, and she did.
Was she? I remember doing an interview with Garret Fitzgerald, who was talking about his time when he was negotiating with Mrs. Thatcher, and he said, I used to think that she was a unionist, but I got her wrong. I discovered she was an English nationalist. Was there something in that?
I think there's a little bit in that, but actually she also, as well as being quite ideological, she was also pragmatic. And in Garret Fitzgerald's case, I mean, she went, despite the opposition of the unions, for the Anglo-Irish agreement, which ultimately led to peace in Northern Ireland. She was somebody who loved argument and would form a position as to what was right, and then she would stick to it. And my goodness me, we could do with a few politicians like that today.
Jim, I'm not saying that this is necessarily your point of view, but isn't Michael right in a sense that the kind of big state solutions, pouring money into industries which are not economic, that orthodoxy is now accepted by the Labour Party and arguably even by the SNP?
Yes, if Margaret Thatcher's legacy is in fact New Labour, then she's got a lot to answer for.
You're changing your ground now.
Yes, she's got a lot to answer for. I think I've got no doubt at all whatsoever that Michael was right when he said that she destroyed socialism. And that's not her fault. She's an opponent of socialism. That's the fault of socialists. We've failed totally intellectually.
No new thinking. No new thinking at all.
We have failed totally intellectually to bring any apparatus of analysis onto the Thatcherite model of the so-called free market. I admit that quite clearly. That's one of the major problems we have. In a sense, that's why old Labour got into New Labour, because it didn't have any answers. And I mean, what's been proven now, of course, is that we are in one hell of a state, thanks to New Labour, thanks to the destruction of socialism.
Colin, are we all Thatcher's children now?
In a sense, yes, but it's an interesting. She was very successful. She started a run of 4 elections, one of the longest terms in the history of the franchise, and people argue that she wasn't really a Tory, she was a Manchester Liberal. She's succeeded by someone after Mr Major, Mr Blair, who was seen not as a member of the Labour Party, but New Labour, and he started a run that's unprecedented in the history of the Labour Party. It's a very interesting political mix, isn't it?
Okay, Colin MacKay, Michael Forsyth, Jim Sillars.